The letter arrived on a Tuesday, as all peculiar things seemed to do in England that autumn. Lord Edmund Hartley had written it himself, not dictated to a secretary, not typed on one of those modern contraptions that cluttered the desks of lesser men, but penned in his own spidery hand on cream stationery, embossed with the Hartley crest. 6 letters, 6 invitations, each worded identically, each carrying the same quiet urgency that compelled the recipient to accept without quite knowing why. The invitation read simply, "I require your presence at Ashgrove Manor, November the 14th. Matters of some considerable importance demand our assembly. Travel arrangements have been made on your behalf. Do not decline." There was no please, there was no warmth. But there was something beneath those few sentences, something that each recipient felt differently, like a cold hand pressed against the chest. Miss Diana Hartley received hers in London, where she had been spending Lord Hartley's money at a rate that ought to have alarmed someone. She read it twice, set it beside her half-eaten breakfast of toast and marmalade, and stared at the crest for a very long time. Her uncle had never summoned her before. He had ignored her, tolerated her, occasionally funded her, but summoned, never. Dr. Philip Crane opened his in his surgery on Harley Street, between appointments. He was a composed man, Dr. Crane, with steady hands and steady eyes, and a manner that patients found either deeply reassuring or faintly unnerving, depending on their constitution. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in his breast pocket, and saw 3 more patients before he permitted himself to think about it again. Colonel Hugh Ashby was cleaning his service revolver when his came, a habit he had never shed despite 15 years of civilian life. He read the letter and set the gun down slowly, which was perhaps the most telling reaction of all. Mrs. Lavinia Price was in her garden in Shropshire, cutting the last of the autumn roses. Her gloves were stained with earth, and she was humming something unidentifiable when her housemaid brought the envelope on a small silver tray. Mrs. Price read it without removing her gloves and hummed a different tune on the way back inside. Thomas Vane, the young solicitor, found his invitation waiting when he returned from a long and unsatisfying lunch with a senior partner. He read it 3 times, pulled out a file from his cabinet, studied several pages, and replaced the file with a care that suggested he wished he could replace his memory of what it contained equally neatly. Rose, the housemaid at Ashgrove Manor itself, received no letter, for she was already there. She had been there for 6 years, and she knew the house in the way that only servants truly know a house, its breathing, its silences, the difference between a creak of wood settling and a creak of someone stepping where they should not step. She knew that Lord Hartley had written those letters in his study late at night, alone, with the fire low. She knew because she had seen the light under his door. She had not listened. She told herself that quite firmly. She had not listened. The train from London to the village of Ashford-on-Mist ran once daily, departing Paddington at 11 and arriving, if the engine cooperated, at 2:30. On the 14th of November, 5 passengers alighted at the small stone station and found Lord Hartley's ancient Daimler waiting, along with his taciturn driver Simmons, who spoke only to announce that the luggage would follow separately. The house became visible from the end of the lane, and even on a clear day it was the sort of house that suggested it would be more comfortable in fog. Built in the late 17th century of dark grey stone, it rose against the leafless trees like something that had grown there organically, drawing sustenance from the cold earth rather than from human habitation. On this particular November afternoon, a low mist was already creeping in from the moorland to the east, softening the edges of things, or making the distance uncertain. Thomas Vane, seated beside Diana Hartley in the motor car, said quietly, "I'd forgotten how it looks." Diana looked at her uncle's house without expression. "No one forgets how it looks," she said. "They only pretend to." Lord Hartley received them in the great hall, all 5 of them together, which struck everyone as slightly unusual, as if he had orchestrated the arrival rather than merely invited it. He was 71, thinner than any of them remembered, with the brittle quality of old parchment that has been handled too often. His eyes, however, were entirely unchanged, dark, assessing, and possessed of that particular intelligence that made people feel they had been weighed before they had opened their mouths. He shook hands with each guest. He didn't embrace Diana, who was his only blood relation present. She did not appear to expect it. Dinner was at 8. Until then, they were at liberty to settle into their rooms, explore the grounds if they wished, or remain in the drawing room where a generous fire had been laid and sherry waited on the sideboard. The atmosphere was one of polished hospitality over a substrate of something harder, the way a beautiful table covering can hide old and damaged wood beneath. Rose moved through the rooms silently, attending to coals and decanters and the 100 small necessities of a house that was not accustomed to guests. She noticed things. She always noticed things. She noticed that Dr. Crane placed his black medical bag not in his wardrobe, but beneath his bed, far back against the wall. She noticed that Colonel Ashby stood for a long time at the window of his room, looking not at the grounds, but at the sky, as if calculating something. She noticed that Thomas Vane went directly to the library when he arrived, before he had even removed his coat, and stood for a moment with his hand resting on the spine of a particular book, not taking it out, simply resting there as if seeking some confirmation. And she noticed later that evening, when the fog had descended properly and Ashgrove Manor had become an island in a grey-white sea, that Lord Hartley dined with them but did not eat. He sat at the head of his table and watched his guests and was, in every sense that mattered, entirely alone. The candles burned low. Outside, the mist settled thick and permanent against the glass. No one spoke of why they had really come, because no one quite knew or admitted to knowing. And the evening passed with the terrible patience of a thing that is only waiting for the right moment to begin. After dinner, the party dispersed with the slightly studied casualness of people performing normality under unusual circumstances. Colonel Ashby proposed billiards to Thomas Vane, who accepted with what struck Rose as excessive gratitude. Mrs. Price settled herself beside the drawing-room fire with a novel she gave no appearance of reading, her eyes travelling over the same paragraph repeatedly while her ears performed the true work of the evening. Diana Hartley went directly upstairs pleading a headache, which no one believed and no one challenged. Lord Hartley requested that Dr. Crane join him in his study. The study was at the north end of the house, a room that had always resisted domestication. Maps covered one wall, not decorative maps with gilded edges, but working maps, some of them pinned with small markers in colours that had faded over the decades. India featured prominently. There was a globe that spun when touched, and a mahogany desk the size of a respectable dining table, clear of all papers save a single folder placed with geometric precision at its centre. Dr. Crane sat in the chair that had been arranged, clearly arranged, not pulled up casually, across from Lord Hartley, and waited. "You know why I've asked you here," Lord Hartley said. "I know why you've asked us all here," Dr. Crane said carefully. "Or I believe I do. Then let us not waste each other's time." Lord Hartley opened the folder but did not refer to it, leaving it open as one leaves a weapon visible without yet drawing it. "You attended my wife for the last 3 years of her life." "I did. And you prescribed her medications." "That was the nature of my role, yes, including the digitalis preparation she took in her final months." A pause of perhaps 3 seconds, which is long enough in such a conversation to constitute a very complete answer. "She had a heart condition," Dr. Crane said. "Digitalis was clinically indicated. The quantity prescribed exceeded the clinical indication rather substantially." Dr. Crane said nothing. "She trusted you implicitly," Lord Hartley continued, "as she trusted a great many people implicitly, which was, in retrospect, the central tragedy of her character." He looked at the doctor with those unchanged dark eyes. "I have had occasion, in recent months, to review certain documents. The question I am asking you, not yet, you understand, but forming in my mind like this fog outside, concerns the distance between clinical prescription and something rather more deliberate. The fire settled. Somewhere in the house, the distant sound of billiard balls clicking in their clean mathematical way. "You should be careful," Dr. Crane said quietly. "I am always careful. I am suggesting that others have not been." Lord Hartley closed the folder. "That will be all for this evening, Philip. Sleep well." Whether Dr. Crane slept well, Rose could not say. She had not listened at the study door. She had simply been in the corridor when he emerged, and the expression on his face was one she had no prior category for, neither guilt nor anger, but something that incorporated elements of both and added a third quality that she would later describe fumblingly as calculation. In the billiard room, the game had concluded. Thomas Vane was sitting in one of the leather chairs that flanked the fireplace, staring into the coals. Colonel Ashby poured 2 fingers of scotch from the decanter on the sideboard and placed 1 glass before Vane without asking. "How long have you known?" the Colonel said. Vane looked up. "Known what?" "Whatever it is that brought that expression to your face the moment we arrived." Vane considered denying it. He was a solicitor after all, and denial was a professional skill. But there was something about Ashby, the old soldier's directness perhaps, or simply the whiskey, that made denial feel inadequate. "The will," he said finally. "There have been alterations. Recent. Within the last 6 weeks. Substantial ones." Ashby sat down heavily. "In whose favour?" "That," Vane said, "is the complicating question. Not in the direction anyone would expect." They sat in silence for a time, both looking at the fire, which is the natural thing to do when one has been presented with information one does not quite know what to do with. It was 10:30 when Rose finally banked the fires in the drawing room and the dining room and checked the locks on the ground floor windows. She was thorough, Rose, in the way that people are thorough, when thoroughness is the only form of control available to them. She checked each window latch, each door catch, noting the fog pressed against every pane like something that wished to enter. The last room she checked was the library. The lock was sound. The windows were secure. The books stood in their tall shelves with the particular majesty of books that are owned rather than read. She had turned to leave when she saw the single sheet of paper on the reading table. Not a letter, not a document, but what appeared to be a list of names. 6 names. Her own was not among them, and she experienced a cold, irrational relief before she replaced the paper exactly as she had found it and left the room. Lord Hartley remained in his study until midnight. Rose knew this because she saw the line of light under his door when she made her final round of the house at 11:45. She did not knock. She had never knocked on that door uninvited and did not begin now. At 12:15, the light went out. At 1 in the morning, Ashgrove Manor lay apparently quiet under its blanket of fog, and whatever was going to happen had not yet happened, or had already been set in motion so carefully that it moved now under its own momentum, requiring nothing further from the person who had started it. The clocks in the hallway ticked their way through the smallest hours. The fog pressed close. The house held its breath. Rose found him at 7 o'clock in the morning. She came to the library first because she always came to the library first. It was her habit, established over 6 years, to open the library curtains before anything else, because Lord Hartley liked to find the room already lit when he descended for his morning constitution. The library faced east, and on clear mornings the light came in with something approaching enthusiasm. This was not a clear morning. The fog had deepened overnight, and when Rose opened the curtains, she saw nothing but white, absolute and indifferent. She turned from the window and saw Lord Hartley in the armchair. She knew immediately. There is a quality to the stillness of the dead that differs from sleep in ways no one who has encountered it once ever fails to recognize again. He was seated in his customary chair, the high-backed leather one angled toward the fireplace, and he looked, in every superficial way, entirely peaceful. His hands lay in his lap. His eyes were closed. His expression had that composed, almost satisfied quality that she had once heard described as the face people wear when they have finally said everything they meant to say. On the small table beside the chair, a cup of tea, half consumed, a candle burned to nothing, the wick cold, and a single sheet of paper face down, which Rose did not touch, but which she could see had writing on it. She did not scream. She backed out of the library, closed the door carefully behind her, and stood for a moment in the corridor with her eyes shut and her breathing very controlled. Then she went to wake Dr. Crane, because he was the doctor, and that was the appropriate order of things. Dr. Crane came immediately, still in his dressing gown, and the set of his face when Rose told him where and how was something she observed closely and filed away without articulating. He went into the library alone first, asking her to wait, which she did, positioned in the corridor where she could see nothing but could hear with perfect clarity the sound of his movements, steps across the floor, a pause, the sound of the armchair creaking. Another pause that lasted long enough to feel significant, then steps again, and the creak of what might have been the window latch. He emerged 2 minutes later with a collected, professional expression. "Please wake the other guests," he said, "and send someone to the village for Inspector Mallory. I will not touch anything further until the police arrive. Shall I telephone? The telephone lines are down. The fog." It took 15 minutes to rouse the household. Diana came downstairs with her hair in perfect order, which told Rose something about the nature of her sleep. Colonel Ashby appeared fully dressed within 3 minutes of being knocked, which told her something else. Thomas Vane came down in a state of genuine dishevelment, blinking, which she chose to interpret charitably as authentic surprise. Mrs. Price wore an expression of concentrated attention that she had perhaps been assembling for some time. They gathered in the hall. Dr. Crane informed them that Lord Hartley appeared to have died during the night, most likely from cardiac failure, and that the police had been sent for. "Appeared to have," Mrs. Price said. She had a way of selecting the relevant word in any sentence with the precision of someone choosing a single instrument from a full orchestra. "I am not yet prepared to state a definitive cause," Dr. Crane said. "No," said Mrs. Price, "I imagine not." The police, when they arrived 2 hours later, in the form of Inspector Mallory and a young constable who looked as though this was rather more than he had expected from rural detective work, brought with them the information that the roads out of Ashford-on-Mist were impassable in both directions due to the fog and would remain so for at least another day, which was, everyone noted without saying, rather convenient, though from whose perspective depended entirely on which story one had already begun to tell oneself. It was Inspector Mallory who thought of Monsieur Poirot. The great Belgian detective was, as it happened, staying at the Ashford Arms in the village below, where he had been stranded since the previous morning, having been on his way back to London from a private consultation in the north. He had spent the preceding 24 hours in a condition of suppressed misery caused by the fog, the inadequacy of the establishment's egg supply, and the absence of any intellectual occupation worthy of his considerable faculties. When Mallory's message reached him, Hercule Poirot put on his coat, his hat, and his most impeccable expression and came up the lane to Ashgrove Manor with the small, precise steps of a man walking toward the thing he does best. He examined the library in silence for 11 minutes. No one spoke during those 11 minutes because there was something about his concentration that made speech feel impertinent. He looked at the body, the teacup, the dead candle, the face-down paper, the window latch, the position of the armchair relative to the door. He touched nothing except the teacup saucer, which he lifted by the edge to observe the small ring of dried liquid beneath, and the window latch, which he examined by turning it back and forth twice. Then he stood in the centre of the room and was still. "Monsieur l'Inspecteur," he said finally, "this is not a natural death." Mallory looked at him steadily. "Dr. Crane says—" "Dr. Crane," said Poirot with a courtesy that was doing considerable work, "says many things. But observe the tea. It was drunk approximately 4 hours before death,
The ring beneath the saucer tells us the cup was set down and not moved, meaning it was consumed, placed there, and Lord Hartley did not reach for it again. Yet the coroner will find he died 2 hours later. A man with heart trouble who drank his evening tea and then sat for 2 hours doing nothing, with this paper before him, face down. He tapped the air above the paper gently, like a conductor noting a particular instrument. A man does not turn a document face down unless he has finished with it and wishes not to see it again, or unless he wishes that no one else should see it. He turned to face the assembled household who had gathered in the doorway. "I shall require," Poirot said pleasantly, "to speak with each of you, separately and at length. I hope you did not have urgent engagements elsewhere." He gestured gently at the fog beyond the windows. "But of course," he said, "neither do you." Poirot conducted his interviews in the morning room, which had the advantage of a single door and windows that looked onto the formal garden rather than the driveway, so that no one could observe who came and went. He sat with his back to the window, which meant the light fell on his interlocutor's face.
And he placed before himself a small notebook which he never wrote in, using it purely as a device to direct the other person's attention while his own eyes did their real work elsewhere. He began with Diana Hartley. She was, he thought, a woman who had constructed herself with considerable care. The beauty was real, but it had been trained, like a garden plant trained along a wall, to present its best aspect in all conditions. She sat across from him with her ankles crossed and her hands still in her lap, and her composure was the composure of someone who has rehearsed composure, not of someone who naturally possesses it. "Your uncle was in good health, mademoiselle. Dr. Crane would know better than I. But you visited him. When was the last occasion before this week?" A pause that lasted perhaps half a second too long. "August. 'Cause I came for a fortnight in August. A pleasant visit. My uncle and I understood each other." "That is not quite the same thing as a pleasant visit." He smiled gently. "You are his nearest relation. The estate is considerable." "I am aware of the estate." "And the will?" Her stillness was complete, which was itself a form of movement. "I am not aware of its contents." "No?" Poirot tilted his head. "But Thomas Vane is your uncle's solicitor, and Thomas Vane came this weekend, and you and Thomas Vane travelled in the same motor car from the station. It would be most unnatural, no, for a woman of your intelligence not to have probed a little during that journey." Diana looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating. "Vane is very discreet. But you asked." A silence. But then, "He told me nothing definitive." "He told you something, however, something that was not what you expected." Poirot nodded, as if she had confirmed this rather than merely declined to deny it. "Tell me about the letters, mademoiselle, in your room." The shift was small, but it was there, a microscopic reorientation, like a compass needle finding north. "What letters?" "I have not yet seen them, but there are letters, I think. From your uncle, yes? Old correspondence. And you brought them with you, which suggests they have a value beyond sentiment." Diana Hartley looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with a different quality to her voice, flatter, more precise, "He threatened to expose something. Several years ago, I behaved imprudently in a financial matter involving his accounts. He knew. He chose not to pursue it publicly, but he kept the documentation." "Ah." Poirot's expression was entirely neutral. "And you wished to recover this documentation before any change in the household's management? Before anyone else found it?" "Quite. And did you? Recover it?" "No." This, at least, had the texture of truth. "I hadn't yet found where he kept it." He thanked her and she left. He sat for a moment, arranging what she had told him alongside what she had not, the way one arranges elements of a recipe before beginning to cook. Colonel Ashby entered with the bearing of a man who has appeared before difficult authorities before and survived. He sat down without being invited to, and looked at Poirot with the frank appraisal of someone who is used to sizing up the capabilities of others quickly. "India," Poirot said.
Ashby blinked. I beg your pardon? The maps in Lord Hartley's study. India featured prominently, and with particular attention to the northwest frontier, which corresponds roughly to the period 1895 to 1900. You served there. How the devil do you know that? Your posture. The particular way a man holds himself who served under specific conditions in a specific terrain. Also, the small regimental pin in your lapel, which I recognize. He waved this away. What happened there between you and Lord Hartley? Ashby was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the careful flatness of someone moving through territory they have mapped exhaustively in their own mind. We were involved in an incident, a civilian incident, a village. It was wartime, or the closest thing to wartime that situation allowed.
And decisions were made. He stopped. Hartley made decisions I disagreed with. I reported my disagreement through proper channels. Nothing came of it. It never does in those circumstances. But you remained friends. We remained associated. There is a difference. He looked at the ceiling briefly. He wrote to me recently suggesting that he intended to make a formal statement. After all these years, a written account with full details, which would have reflected poorly on you as well. On both of us. Differently, but yes. And yet you came when invited. When Hartley invited you, you came, Ashby said simply. That was simply how it was. Thomas Vane was next, young and unhappy, with the strained quality of someone carrying a weight that has exceeded their structural tolerance. He sat down and immediately said, I want to make clear that I acted entirely within the law. That is generally the protestation of someone who acted right at its edges, Poirot observed pleasantly. The will, Monsieur Vane. Tell me about the will. Vane looked at his hands. Lord Hartley revised his will 6 weeks ago, substantially. The previous version divided the estate primarily between Miss Hartley and several charitable foundations. The revised version, he paused, the revised version leaves the bulk of the estate to someone outside the immediate circle, a woman named Margaret Fenwick in Yorkshire, a name I did not recognize. And this information you shared with? No one. Then, after a breath, Miss Hartley asked, in the car. I told her the will had been revised, nothing more. But nothing more was necessary, Poirot said thoughtfully. If you were Diana Hartley, and you had certain information about your own financial irregularities, and you learned the will had changed against your interests, the shape of the problem would become quite clear, would it not? One would not need the details. One would only need to know that time had become a consideration. Vane looked at him with the expression of a man who very much wishes he could say that was not his reading of the situation. Precisely, said Poirot quietly. Precisely so. Rose had been dreading this conversation, not because she had done anything wrong. She was quite sure of that, in the way that one is sure of things one has rehearsed being sure of many times. She had done nothing wrong. She had observed. That was different. Observing was simply a consequence of existing in a house, of being present in rooms, of having eyes and ears that functioned as they were designed to function. She sat across from Monsieur Poirot and folded her hands and waited. He did not begin with a question. He began by looking at her for a moment with an expression that she could only describe as kind, not the brisk professional kindness of someone performing an expected courtesy, but the kind that arrives quietly and sits down and makes no demands. She found, to her own surprise, that her carefully assembled composure was more threatened by this than it would have been by a more aggressive approach. You have been here 6 years, he said. Yes, sir. And in 6 years you have learned this house completely. It is my work to know the house, sir. Oui. But there is knowing that is merely practical, and knowing that is deeper.
The way a musician knows their instrument not only by where the keys are, but by how each key sounds at different hours, in different weather. He paused. You know this house that second way. She said nothing, which was a form of agreement. The night Lord Hartley died, Poirot said, you made your final round of the house at 11:45. "That is my custom, sir." "And you noted the light under the study door?" "Yes." "Did you hear anything from within the study?" The pause was small, but it was there, and Poirot, she suspected, was the sort of person for whom small pauses spoke volumes. "Voices," she said finally. "Two voices." "At 11:45. Yes, sir." Lord Hartley had, by his own account to the other guests, retired for the evening at 10. Yet at 11:45 there were two voices in his study. "Yes, sir." "Could you identify the second voice?" Here she stopped. Here was the precipice. She was not a stupid woman. She knew perfectly well what it meant to name the voice, what machinery it would set in motion, what responsibility she would assume. She had thought about it all morning, in the kitchen and the corridors, turning it over the way one turns something heavy and awkward to find the side that is easiest to grip. "It was Dr. Crane's voice," she said. Poirot did not react beyond a very small nod, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected, but wished to hear from a witness who had no prior category for it. "And the tone of the conversation?" "Heated, sir. I couldn't make out words, but the tone." Lord Hartley's voice was the lower one, controlled, like he was stating facts. "And Doctor?"
Crane's was, I'd call it frightened, sir. But angry frightened, if you understand me. The kind of frightened that comes out as something else. As aggression. As that, yes. And how long did this conversation last, from your perspective? I only heard it for a moment, sir. I didn't linger in the corridor. No, said Poirot. Of course not. His tone was entirely without irony, and she believed him. There is something else. It was not a question. She had told herself she would not say it. She had gone back and forth on it precisely 17 times since she had found Lord Hartley that morning. She had counted, finding the counting helpful, as one counts steps going down a dark staircase. "The medical bag, sir," she said. "Dr. Crane's. When I turned down his room yesterday afternoon, it was under the bed. This morning, when I went in to bring hot water, it was on the wardrobe shelf. He moved it. Between the middle of the night and 6 in the morning, yes. I notice where things are in the rooms. It is part of my work." "Yes," Poirot said. "And was the bag in any way different? Its appearance, its weight, perhaps, if you had cause to move it?" "I didn't move it, sir, but—" She hesitated. "Yesterday it clinked when the car went over the rough part of the lane. I was fetching luggage and I heard it. Today, when I carried it down at his request to the hall, it didn't." Poirot looked at her with that same careful, complete attention. "You are a remarkable witness, Rose. I just noticed things, sir." "That is what I said." He leaned forward slightly. "Now, the paper in the library. The sheet on the reading table that was face down when you found the body. Before you went to wake Dr. Crane, before anyone else entered, did you see anything of what was on that paper?" She had. She had seen 3 lines of it before the door opened fully, before the full reality of what she was looking at had registered and her attention had narrowed to the figure in the chair. She had seen 3 lines and she had thought at the time that they made no sense. Looking back, they made a great deal of sense. "It was a list of names, sir," she said. "The same 6 names as the list in the library the night before, but this one had something written next to each name." She closed her eyes briefly to see it more clearly. Beside Lord Hartley's own name it said, "Forgive me," and beneath that, in different handwriting, "Sir," quite different. Hurried and heavy. Someone had added 2 words. Which words? "Too late," said Rose. The room was very quiet. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass with its customary indifference. "Too late," Poirot repeated softly. He sat for a moment in that stillness that was peculiar to him. Not the stillness of a man who is thinking about what to say next, but of a man who is allowing the last piece of a structure to settle into place and bearing the weight of what that structure turns out to be. "Thank you, Rose," he said. "You may go, but please, do not discuss this conversation with any member of the household." "No, sir." She rose. At the door she paused. "Sir, will it come right?" "In the end?" Poirot looked at her. Truth has a way of coming right, he said. What follows from it is a more complicated question. But the truth, yes.
The truth will come right. That afternoon, while the household variously read and brooded and performed small domestic acts that were mostly forms of anxiety in disguise, Poirot walked. He walked the length of the west corridor 3 times, his small feet making no sound on the Turkish carpet, his hands clasped behind his back. He walked through the library, which had been locked by Inspector Mallory, and then unlocked at Poirot's quiet request, and he stood in it for a time, doing nothing that an observer would have found impressive. He looked at the lamp. He looked at the arrangement of furniture. He looked at the precise location of the armchair relative to the door, the window, and the fireplace. Then he walked to the garden. It was an act of mild eccentricity on a morning when the fog had thinned to a mere dimness but had not departed, and the garden presented itself in tones of grey and damp brown that he found, he admitted privately, rather beautiful in a way that his native tidiness of mind was reluctant to acknowledge. He stood on the gravel path and looked at the east wing of the house, and particularly at the windows of the library and the study and the small room between them that the household called the anteroom. The anteroom had no function he had yet been able to identify. It contained 2 chairs, a lamp, and a small table. It connected the library to the study by way of a door at each end, both of which were generally kept closed. He had noted it on his initial tour and filed it as a detail of potential significance,
which was a category he maintained for things he did not yet understand, but whose texture suggested they would prove relevant. He returned inside. In the kitchen, where he had, in the brief hour of acquaintance, established a friendly relationship with Mrs. Fitch the cook, primarily through a genuine and expressed appreciation for her shortbread. He sat at the kitchen table and said, "Mrs. Fitch, tell me about Lord Hartley's health." Mrs. Fitch, who was a woman of 60 with the complexion of someone who has spent 30 years in proximity to ovens, set down her rolling pin and looked at him. "His heart," she said. "Yes. How serious?" "Serious enough that he was on medication. Had been for 2 years. Dr. Crane's prescription, taken each evening with dinner." "Each evening without exception." "I never missed it," she said,
with a firm pride that indicated the administration of the medication had been her responsibility. "Liquid, in his water glass. A measured dose." Poirot looked at the kitchen table with great thoughtfulness. "And last night?" "Same as always. I measured it myself. Same dose, same time, same glass." The water glass that was afterward washed. Mrs. Fitch looked at him. Then she looked at the sink, then back at him. "Yes," she said, with a slightly different quality to her voice. "I wash up after dinner." "Of course, naturally. Did you notice anything unusual about the dosage bottle? Its level, perhaps?" She frowned, the frown of someone going back through memory carefully. "It was low," she said slowly. "I noticed it was lower than it ought to be. But I thought I'd miscounted the days." "You had not miscounted the days." "No," she said quietly. "I suppose not." He thanked her and returned to the morning room, where he sat down with his notebook, still blank, still performing its function as a prop, and engaged in what he privately described as the conversation of the little grey cells. The architecture of the crime, as he understood it now, was this. Lord Hartley had assembled his guests for a reason, and that reason was, in its essential nature, confrontation. He had accumulated, over many years, and with the specific patience of an intelligent man who has been wronged by people he trusted, enough information about enough people to constitute a very considerable form of power. The 6 names on the list were not guests, they were subjects. He had brought them here not for a dinner party, but for a species of private tribunal in which he would be judge, and what he intended to do with his judgments was not yet clear. But someone among the 6 had understood the nature of the tribunal before they arrived, or had understood it after Dr. Crane's conversation with Lord Hartley the previous evening. The conversation overheard by Rose,
The heated conversation in which a frightened man had said things that, when combined with what he already knew, had crystallized the situation into something requiring immediate resolution. The medication. That was the mechanism. The cardiac medication that Mrs. Fitch administered each evening at dinner had been altered. Not replaced, that would have been too risky, but supplemented. Additional digitalis,
but introduced into the bottle at some point between the previous evening's dose and the morning. No, not into the bottle. If the bottle showed an unexplained reduction, the crime would be obvious. Into the evening drink then, the tea, the half-consumed cup. But who had access to the library between when? Lord Hartley had drunk the tea, set it down, and sat for 2 hours before dying. He had been in the library at that point, alone, or so everyone believed. But the anteroom connected the library to the study, and the study window, he had checked it that morning, showed faint marks in the condensation on the inside of the glass that were inconsistent with the window having remained closed all night. Poirot sat with the picture complete before him,
to checking each element against each other element with the methodical satisfaction of a craftsman whose joints have fitted precisely. One question remained. The motive was not singular. Multiple people in this house had sufficient reason. The question was whose reason had reached the specific temperature of desperation that evening that had tipped it from motive into action. The answer was in Dr. Crane's medical bag, now on the wardrobe shelf where it had not been before. He needed to see the bag. He needed one more conversation. He needed, more than anything, to stop the person who had added those 2 words, in different handwriting, to Lord Hartley's final document, before they understood that Rose had seen the list and drew the only conclusion that would follow from that understanding. He rose and went to find Inspector Mallory. Inspector Mallory was a practical man, which meant he was both an asset and a limitation. He dealt in the visible and the provable, which were sound instincts for a policeman, but occasionally insufficient for situations in which the crucial evidence was the kind that required one to reason backward from its implications rather than forward from its presence. Poirot had worked with him before on a matter in Berkshire 2 years prior, and the relationship was one of mutual professional respect arranged around a tacit understanding that Mallory would provide access and Poirot would provide conclusions, and each would maintain the official fiction that this was a collaborative arrangement. "The bag," Poirot said. Mallory had it opened within the hour. This required a key, which Dr. Crane, as after a prolonged moment in which every member of the drawing-room could observe the quality of his hesitation, produced from his waistcoat pocket. He watched the inspection with a composed face and tightly clasped hands. The bag contained the standard equipment of a country doctor on a weekend visit: stethoscope, thermometer, blood pressure apparatus, a small collection of standard medications in their bottles. There was a space, not an empty space, but the kind of space left by something recently removed, between the blood pressure apparatus and a packet of lint bandages. The space was approximately the dimensions of a small glass vial. "Something is missing," Poirot said. "The bag is complete," Dr. Crane said. "The bag contains what you chose to leave in it."
The space suggests what you did not choose to leave in it. Poirot turned to look at him with an expression of perfect courtesy. "Shall I tell you what was there? A small vial of concentrated digitalis preparation, the same preparation in a more potent concentration that was prescribed to Lady Hartley in her final illness, and the over-prescription of which Lord Hartley had been until last night in the process of investigating." The drawing-room was very quiet. "I should like to search the room," Mallory said to Poirot, in a tone that suggested he was really saying this to Dr. Crane. "You'll find nothing in the room," Dr. Crane said. "I disposed of it." Into the silence that followed this statement, which was, as everyone present recognized, a confession stripped of its narrative context but unmistakable in its essence, Dr. Crane sat down. He sat down the way a structure sits down when its supporting elements are removed, not collapsed but settled with a kind of finality. "I didn't intend," he began. "Do not say what you intended," Poirot said, not unkindly. "It will not help you, and it will not be accurate. What you intended was a flexible thing that evening, I think. What you did was not." Crane looked at him. "She asked me to." His voice was very even. "The night before, Diana, she came to my room, and she said she needed something that would stop his heart without being apparent. She knew about the Lady Hartley matter. She'd known for years. She said if I refused, she would tell the police what I had done and my career, my life." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I told myself I was protecting myself." That is the comfortable lie one tells. "You went to the library," Poirot said, "through the anteroom." Lord Hartley had gone to the library at 10, as was his custom. The anteroom was the only way to approach without being seen from the corridor. I introduced the preparation into his tea while he was at his desk, writing. He did not see me. The anteroom door makes no sound. A pause. He was writing those notes, the ones on the paper. He knew someone was there. Crane looked up sharply. "He wrote the words, 'Forgive me,'" Poirot said. "He was not writing to you, or to any one person. He was writing in the full understanding of what he had set in motion, the confrontations, the accusations, the pain, and perhaps in the understanding of what it would cost some among you."
He was a man making his final account with himself. Poirot paused. "And someone took the list afterward and added 'too late.' In your handwriting, I think, Dr. Crane." The silence had a different quality now. "I went back," Crane said quietly. "At 3 in the morning, when I was certain. I went to confirm, and I found the paper, and I—" He closed his eyes. "It was anger, or something that felt like anger." "It felt like relief," Poirot said. "Relief wearing the clothing of anger. The thing one feels when a source of danger has been removed." He stood. "I am sorry for you, Dr. Crane. I am sorry in the way that one is sorry for someone who chose badly at a moment when choosing well would have cost them a great deal. It does not change what must happen." Mallory was already moving, but Poirot was looking at Diana Hartley.
Who had not moved from her chair, and whose beautiful, constructed face was now doing a different kind of work, the work of recalculating rapidly what this meant for her own position. She met his eyes, and he saw, behind her composure, the first real emotion she had displayed since arriving at Ashgrove Manor. Fear. Not grief, not shock. Fear. "Miss Hartley," Poirot said pleasantly, "you will find that a woman who conspired to murder her uncle is not well placed to inherit from him. And the documentation you came here to recover, I took the liberty of finding it before you could this morning, while you were at breakfast. It is now in Inspector Mallory's possession." He paused. "I hope, for your sake, that your solicitor is better than Mr. Vane, who will have his own difficulties with the law regarding certain failures of disclosure." Diana Hartley looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "He deserved it." "That," said Poirot, "is the argument that has been used to justify every crime that was ever committed. It is the argument least likely to be objectively assessed by the person making it." He went to stand by the window. Outside, for the first time in 2 days, he could see the outline of the trees. The fog was beginning to lift. The afternoon that followed the arrest of Dr. Crane and the formal questioning of Diana Hartley had the particular quality of aftermath. The strange, cotton-wrapped silence that descends when the thing that has been building for days has finally happened, and the air itself seems to be rearranging its molecules back into something like normal.
Inspector Mallory was methodical and thorough, qualities that Poirot respected unreservedly, and by 4 o'clock the formal statements had been taken, the evidence catalogued, and the relevant parties confined to their rooms pending the road's clearing. The fog continued its slow withdrawal, apologetically, as though embarrassed by the role it had played. Colonel Ashby found Poirot in the garden at 4:30, standing by the stone balustrade that separated the formal garden from the wild moorland beyond. The Colonel had brought 2 glasses of whisky, which Poirot declined with genuine regret. He had a complex relationship with whiskey that was primarily geographical in origin, and Ashby drank both one after the other without particular signs of effect. "The business about India," Ashby said. "Does it have to come out?" Poirot considered this. "That is Inspector Mallory's determination, not mine. But I will tell you what I think. Lord Hartley was not preparing criminal accusations. He was preparing a personal statement. He wished to speak for his own reasons, and I think those reasons were connected to the possibility that his own time was limited. A man who knows he is dying makes a different kind of accounting than one who expects to continue." Ashby was quiet for a moment. His heart was genuinely bad then. Very bad. Dr. Crane, whatever his other failings, was prescribing the medication legitimately. Lord Hartley might have lived another year, or another month. The treatment he received last night merely accelerated. And the statement he intended to make about the village. "I believe," Poirot said carefully,
"that Lord Hartley intended to state what happened truthfully and to include his own culpability in it alongside yours. This was not a prosecution he was planning. It was an act of clarity, perhaps of penance." He paused. "Whether that is a comfort or not, I cannot judge from outside the experience." Ashby held his empty glass and looked at the moorland. "We were very young," he said finally. "That is not an excuse. I want you to understand I am not offering it as an excuse. I understand. I have thought about it every day for 30 years. I believe you," Poirot said. And he did. Mrs. Lavinia Price appeared at the drawing-room window, observed them briefly with her sharp eyes, and withdrew. She had, Poirot reflected. He has been the most useless witness and the most perceptive observer in the household, possessing almost everything of relevance and volunteering almost nothing. He would speak with her before he left. Thomas Vane had spent the afternoon with a solicitor's precision reviewing his own legal position, which Poirot judged to be uncomfortable but not fatal. He had not actively conspired. He had failed, through what the courts would weigh as professional negligence or something more deliberate, to act on information that suggested criminal intent. The outcome would depend considerably on how he characterized his conversation with Diana Hartley in the motor car, and whether the court believed that what he had told her had been calculated to enable, or merely incidentally to inform. Vane himself seemed to understand this. He had been very quiet since Dr. Crane's confession, with the specific quietness of someone revising their narrative carefully. Rose had served tea at 3:30 to the drawing-room, the corridor, and the remaining guests with the steady competence of someone who has decided that the ordinary work of the world must continue regardless of what extraordinary things have happened within it. Poirot, accepting a cup, had said quietly, "You are quite safe, Rose. There is nothing here that touches you except your own admirable honesty." She had looked at him with those careful eyes and said simply, "Thank you, sir. I mean it as a genuine observation, not merely a reassurance. Your evidence was essential. Not only the medical bag and the voices, but the list. Without knowing those final words had been added after the fact. In a second hand, the picture would have been less clear. I only told you what I saw, sir." "That is the whole of what witnessing requires," Poirot said. "The difficulty is that so few people are willing to do it." The paper itself, the list with its 6 names and its 2 categories of handwriting, was now in Mallory's evidence envelope. Poirot had photographed it in his mind with the same thoroughness he brought to all documents, and he carried it now as a complete image. Lord Hartley's controlled, spidery hand next to each name, the brief annotation, the acknowledgement of wrong done or suffered, and next to his own name in that same hand, "Forgive me." Not a request, he thought, but a statement. He had forgiven himself. He had made his accounting. He had set it in writing as a final act of order, the last expression of a nature that had always needed things to be named clearly, whatever pain the naming caused. The 2 words added by Crane, "too late," said more about their author than about their subject. A man adding those words in the small hours of the morning beside the body of someone he had just killed was telling the truth about himself in a way he had not intended. Not a declaration about Lord Hartley's forgiveness, a revelation about his own. Poirot went inside. He had one more conversation to conduct, and then he would pack his bag and wait for the roads. The fog he saw from the east window had retreated as far as the moorland. The trees were visible again, bare and black against a sky that was not quite clearing, but was at least honest about what it was. He found Mrs. Price in the small sitting room off the hall.
Exactly where he had expected to find her, in the chair with the best view of the door. "You knew," he said, sitting across from her. "I suspected," she said. "When?" "When Crane came to dinner and didn't look at Diana for the entire meal. People who are innocent of each other look at each other. People with a shared secret avoid it with great deliberateness. You said nothing." "I had no evidence, only an impression." She looked at him steadily. "I have lived long enough to know that impressions, however accurate, require evidence before they can be spoken aloud in serious company. I was waiting for mine. And when it did not arrive in time?" She looked at him without flinching. "That is the question I will live with, Monsieur Poirot. Not comfortably, but honestly." He nodded. It was, he thought,
the most honest thing anyone in this house had said to him. The roads opened at 10 o'clock on the morning of the 16th of November, 2 days after the guests had arrived, and a world away, in terms of the particular density of experience from the pleasant autumn visit it had been advertised as. Poirot's bags were brought down by Simmons, the taciturn driver, who had said nothing throughout the entire affair with the consistency of a man who had made a philosophical commitment to silence, and placed in the hallway beside those of the other departing guests. There was a quality to the morning that Poirot recognized, the specific brightness of air from which something heavy has been removed, the world reasserting its ordinary dimensions. Colonel Ashby was leaving for London on the first train.
He shook Poirot's hand in the hallway with a grip that communicated something that was too complicated for words and probably better left that way. "I shall speak to Mallory," he said, "about India, on my own terms and in full." "I think that is the correct course," Poirot said. "I don't think it will end well for me." "No, but it will end honestly, which is a different kind of ending." He paused. "Lord Hartley understood the difference. It was, I believe, why he invited you. He wanted you to have the opportunity he was going to give himself, to state the truth before the end." Ashby put on his hat with the precise movements of old military habit. "He was a difficult man to like," he said. "Yes, he was a much easier man to respect." Thomas Vane departed quietly, without meeting anyone's eyes in particular, carrying the weight of several conversations that he would be having with his own professional body in the weeks to come. He had aged, Poirot thought, about 5 years in 2 days, which was the rapid tax that the proximity of serious crime levied on the constitutionally honest. Mrs. Price shook Poirot's hand with dry, cool firmness. "You handled it well," she said, which from her was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The girl rose. "She'll be all right?" "She will be more than all right. She has the rarest of qualities, the willingness to say clearly what she has seen, without decoration and without suppression. It is a quality that serves one well throughout a life." Mrs. Price looked at him with something that might, in a less controlled face, have been warmth. "You're speaking about yourself as well as about her." "Naturellement," Poirot said pleasantly. Diana Hartley had been taken to the village the previous afternoon, accompanied by Mallory, and was currently in the custody of a more professionally equipped establishment than Ashgrove Manor. The full weight of the charges against her would be determined by processes that were now out of Poirot's hands and properly in those of the law, which he trusted, within its limitations, to do what it was designed to do. He stood in the library for a few final minutes alone. The room had been restored to its ordinary state, curtains open, fire laid but not yet lit. The armchair returned to its customary position. The small table beside the armchair had been cleared. The teacup was gone. The space was simply a room again. As all spaces eventually become simply spaces again, indifferent to what they have witnessed. But Poirot stood in it and saw it whole. Lord Hartley at his writing table in the middle of the night, composing the truest document of his long and complicated life. A man who had used his intelligence as a weapon for 70 years, setting it down at last and writing instead something simpler and harder. The acknowledgements, the accountings, and then the final line beside his own name, "Forgive me." He had written it for no one in particular, Poirot thought, which meant he had written it for everyone. For the wife he had failed to protect better, for the friends he had watched drift into their own darkness, for the young woman whose financial indiscretion he had held like a key rather than offering the mercy of forgetting. For the village in India, about which he had known and not acted once, long ago, when acting would have cost him something he had not then been prepared to pay. He had been, in the end, attempting something very human, to leave the accounts balanced, to make the whole thing, the long, complicated ledger of a life, come out even. The fog had cleared entirely now. Through the east-facing window, Poirot could see the moorland stretching out in the pale November light, brown and vast and entirely itself, making no apologies for what it was. He found it this morning rather beautiful. Simmons was waiting at the front door with the motor car, its engine running, producing small, patient puffs of exhaust in the cold air. Poirot settled himself in the back seat with his customary arrangements, hat precisely placed, coat buttoned, the small discomforts of travel acknowledged and accounted for in advance. "The station, sir?" Simmons said. "The station, yes." The motor car moved down the lane, away from Ashgrove Manor, and Poirot watched the house diminish in the rear window with the analytical attention he gave to all departures, noting what diminished, what remained. The house became smaller. The bare trees closed in around it. The grey stone, without the fog to soften it, showed its true age, very old, very patient, still standing. At the bottom of the lane, where it met the village road, he saw Rose standing at the gate of the neighbouring cottage, a basket over her arm. She saw the motor car and recognised it, and paused. They looked at each other through the window for a moment as the car slowed for the turning. Poirot nodded. She nodded back. Then the car turned and the lane was behind them, and ahead was the village, and then the road, and then the train, and then London, and the ordinary world with its ordinary crimes and its ordinary liars. But there was something he carried with him from Ashgrove Manor that he did not always carry from his cases. Not satisfaction exactly, though that was present. Not completion, though the logic had resolved with the neatness he required. Something quieter than either. The fog had lifted, and the truth was sitting in the plain November light, exactly where it had always been, waiting with that patience particular to truths. The patience of something that does not need to be found in order to be real, but that changes everything when it finally is. Hercule Poirot closed his eyes as the train pulled out of Ashford-on-Mist station, and allowed himself just for a moment to be still. The little grey cells, he thought, with a quiet, private satisfaction, have done their work.